Hello viewers and welcome back to Sahara TV. With me now is Professor Adel Iskandar, a scholar of Arab Studies at Georgetown University whose research focuses on the media and communication. He is with us here today to speak about the ongoing situation in Egypt as it appears we're moving toward the installation of an interim government, but there's still ongoing pro and anti-Morsi protests, and as we have heard last, Morsi is still in detention by the military. So we're just going to get an update on this entire situation. Thank you, Professor Iskandar, for being us here today on Sahara TV.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
So we see that pro and anti-Morsi protests are still going on, and the military is moving forward, it appears, to install an interim government, and they have said that parliamentary elections are planning to take place perhaps in the beginning of next year, and then with presidential elections to follow once the parliament has convened. Now, the Muslim Brotherhood came out and said that they will not cease protesting until Morsi is reinstated. Now, is there the possibility going forward, in your opinion, that this will lead to a breakdown in talks or stall the interim government from being installed, or in fact lead to the possibility of Morsi being reinstated?
Well, to be perfectly honest with you, it looks like the two camps in Egypt today really don't see eye to eye anymore. They're both speaking past each other. The military seems to have put and hedged all of its bets behind the opposition groups, and is really moving forward to try and sort of stabilize the situation, set up at least the procedure, the democratic procedure, starting with amendments to the Constitution. You'll remember that the Constitution was a deeply divisive document, starting with its drafting primarily by Muslim Brotherhood legislators, and was boycotted by a substantial proportion of the population. So the first sort of corrective measure that the interim government is doing is to go back and redraft and revisit this Constitution, then moving to parliamentary elections, and then finally presidential. And I think to a large extent, ignoring the Muslim Brotherhood's calls for the reinstatement of Morsi is creating a new status quo, or sort of the term that's often used to describe politics in the Middle East, which is realities on the ground, that the Muslim Brotherhood will not be able to reinstate Morsi, even if they come out in large numbers and protest. It's just he's a burnt card. And so perhaps strategically what the Muslim Brotherhood need to do is to kind of revisit their calls and their claims and what it is that they expect to see. There's no question that Morsi was a failing president in the time that he was in office, by recognition not just of the opposition and the military and the police forces and the judiciary and the media, but even the Muslim Brotherhood themselves. They recognized at the end that Morsi may not have enshrined the democratic principles that even they wanted to see moving forward. So perhaps by advocating the return of Morsi is itself a strategic blunder. But again, I think the game of brinksmanship is still happening on the streets of Egypt. There's a recognition that the street trumps every political and democratic procedure. If you're able to bring out millions, then you're able to undermine any authority whatsoever. And so both groups continue to rally into the streets. The Muslim Brotherhood, perhaps with more energy in the last couple of days, in the last week or so, having lost pretty much everything. I mean, you'll go back a good 6 to 9 months ago, and they were basically at the helm. They were in the driver's seat. Today, they find themselves not only in the streets rather than the hallways of power, but they're also being pursued by the military on grounds of incitement of violence and various other violations and corruption, etc. So there's a witch hunt against the Muslim Brotherhood, and they're forced to play street politics in hope of getting or extracting at least a few concessions from the military today and the interim government. They don't seem to have gotten anything just yet, as the train has left the station, and they're basically left to the wayside to yell in the streets without really being paid attention to. So it's a really, distressing situation in Egypt today. The polarization is much more entrenched than ever before. But then again, that's exactly what the Muslim Brotherhood had done to their adversaries over the past year, basically ignored them as they moved forward. So the only way to really sort of resolve the situation and reconcile is for the interim government and the military to reach across the aisle and invite the Muslim Brotherhood, and for the Muslim Brotherhood to basically suspend their intransigent stubbornness and really, pragmatically come to the table to discuss what could be done at this point. So the collision course is not going to pay anybody any good, and will really, will further enshrine the power of the military in Egypt. I mean, any confrontation is just going to strengthen the hand of the military, and that's something that neither the Muslim Brotherhood and its Islamist allies, nor the opposition side and the revolutionary youth want to see happen.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the reconciliation, because also today it seems that the public prosecutor's office in Egypt has said that they're investigating some complaints that have been brought against President Morsi and other somewhat high-level members of the Muslim Brotherhood. And they think that this might actually be a step back for the possible reconciliation if they're going after some of their members. Now, going forward, I mean, obviously, like you said, this is a possibility that if the sides don't come together or can't put their differences aside, there will be a strengthening of the military. And do you think at this point there's any regrets on the side of the opposition for calling in the military, given this possibility of the entrenchment that appears to be happening now, in the sense of, like, maybe, it was a long time before Morsi was elected following Mubarak stepping down, and it was some trouble with the interim government and the military kind of like trading back and forth on ruling Egypt during that time. So do you see them having maybe second thoughts about the army standing in for what they say, standing in for democracy and the people?
I mean, I'm glad you asked this question. I mean, there are always regrets associated with calling in the military to do your own political bidding for you. But it really is a testament to how blunderous and how disastrous and catastrophic the last year under Mohamed Morsi has been, that even those individuals and revolutionaries who just a year prior were the ones calling for the end of military rule. They had been punished by the military. 12,000 of them had been detained under military trials without legal counsel. Many of them tortured. Some of the women subjected to virginity tests. I mean, the list goes on as far as the military's violations. But these very same people have felt that that the country was moving towards not just authoritarianism, but theocratic authoritarianism that simply doesn't deal well with politics and doesn't produce results economically. So they've rushed back towards the military in hope that they can basically hit the reset button and reboot the system in such a way that everybody will get a fair share and get a chance at the democratic process again, after having been ostracized and really nudged to the side by the Islamists. But there, make no mistake about it, the opposition is extremely conscious of the military and the military's ambitions might be, and they believe full-heartedly that that if the military tries to capitalize on this popular uprising in such a way that they intrude and really oversee politics, that the military themselves will find themselves on a collision course with the very people who called them in. So the military might be the final and last default arbiter when you've got a political collision course underway, but there's a recognition across the political spectrum that nobody wants military rule to return, and that the military's strong hand should not be used in a gratuitous way against political opposition. It's the very revolutionaries that we're hearing from now, basically saying that the targeting of the Muslim Brotherhood could be the beginning of a quashing of political life that might come back to haunt us in the future. So they don't want to see the Muslim Brotherhood targeted and violated in the manner that they have over the past week, for fear that the military will turn around and go after every political adversary. And really, the military has very few friends politically,
Right.
in the grand scheme of things. It's a marriage of convenience for the time being, but I imagine this marriage will not last indefinitely.
Along those lines, now a similar situation occurred in Algeria in the early 90s. In December 1991, we saw the Islamic Salvation Front win national democratic elections, and by January of 1992, the military had ousted that party and went after the Islamists as well. And that led to an all-out civil war in the country. Is there any fear, like you said, the military has very few friends. If it's possible right now, it seems to be that they're clamping down on the Brotherhood. But if they were to turn and maybe clamp down, like you mentioned, on political life and maybe some of these opposition groups as well, is there a fear that these groups will be forced to take up arms and something like what happened in Algeria could happen?
To be perfectly honest with you, I think the Algeria analogies are a little bit far-fetched and really don't take into consideration the nuances of Egyptian political life.
Okay.
The Muslim Brotherhood are, to a large extent, a very sophisticated political machine.
Right.
They may use violence in such a way so as to extract the kind of concessions that they want to see from the military. But by and large, they understand that Egyptians do not really agree with the language of violence.
Okay.
And at the same time, the military itself does not want to engage in an all-out, full-fledged battle in the streets of Egypt. Egyptians are themselves divided. It's not just, the pursuit of a specific cadre of political operatives in the Brotherhood. And there's a recognition on the part of the Brotherhood as well that, as opposed to what happened in Algeria in January of 1992, when the military effectively subverted, a democratic election literally at its point of germination from the moment that it happened. What happened in Egypt was a year later, and it came on the heels of 22 million petition calling for the removal of Morsi, and at least 10, if not more, million people protesting in the streets of Egypt all over the country. So this is not, this is anchored in deep and popular discontentment against the Muslim Brotherhood and their actions and policies. So it's in the best interest of the Brotherhood not to confront neither the military nor really the scores of people across the country who perceive them as adversaries, but rather to really tone down the rhetoric and not seek sort of a military or an armed resolution to this. And so I suspect that neither party would benefit from going down route of Algeria. And of course, we've seen what the outcomes of Algeria have been for the Islamists. So it's a learning experience for the Brotherhood, and perhaps there are slightly more radical comrades and compatriots. So I don't see Algeria really unfolding in Egypt, and the evidence over the last week or so seems to indicate that there will eventually be discussions behind the scenes more so than at the end of the gun barrel.
Okay, thank you for that. I just had one question on the precedent possibly being set by this. The army came out in favor of the people and said that they stand on the side of democracy. Do you see this as being unique to, like you mentioned, the nuances of Egyptian politics, or is it possible that this might set some precedents for African countries also struggling to institute democracy?
Well, I mean, across Africa, there are different sort of complexities in each country. Some countries are ruled by sort of military juntas that have slowly sort of adapted to the democratic process and created, at least a facade of political legitimacy, but really rule with an iron fist without necessarily sort of a popular base. And then we have other countries that are ruled by, like a clear and blatant iron fist. And there are other countries that have moved towards, democratic rule in a functional way. The Egyptian scenario is interesting and compelling, and perhaps even presents unique learning experiences, not just within Africa, but for democracies at large, that basically the ballot box is not the only determinant of democratic progress, that deep popular discontentment and declining political participation at the ballot box can sometimes present novel alternatives. And take for instance, even here in the United States, if the Occupy movement had not been, 100,000 people at its crescendo, but 70 or 80 million people protesting, then irrespective of how the democratic process exists, it would have to take account of this incredible rapture in the political system as it's represented by public participation. That's really numerically, that's the equivalent of how many people protested by unit population in Egypt, somewhere in the range of 10, 15, 20, perhaps even 20 million in the case of petition signatures. So the same thing goes in what goes in Egypt goes in Africa, and what happens in Africa happens in Egypt. That there is the popular pulse has the ability, if mobilized and organized in a functional way, to really send a clear message to authorities and in the hallways of power that that change needs to happen. In some cases, it needs to happen in a very radical and instantaneous way. That waiting 4 years to see if something materializes is not necessarily the timeline that the population at large wants to see results in. So I think it's just an interesting way of doing politics nowadays. The is perhaps as viable, if not more so, than the ballot box sometimes. But again, how do you calibrate that? How do you measure it? How do you identify what's good for the country at large? And
right.
How do politicians and the security apparatus deal with this level of participation? That's that's going to be the learning experience from Egypt. But I think a lot can be said about the impact of such a scenario if utilized by publics across Africa.
Okay. Just one final question. So if moving forward we do see reconciliation and the interim government steps in, parliamentary elections and eventually presidential elections are held next year, in the event the Muslim Brotherhood does come out on top, what are your predictions on that?
I think, for the most part, I would like to see the Muslim Brotherhood not disappear from Egyptian politics, but rather be an active participant. I imagine that one of two options will occur, or they have one of two options to follow, either to become more and more entrenched and insular. And of course, if they win in such a circumstance, then Egypt will inadvertently find itself in a very peculiar situation and a collision course. Or alternatively, what they can do is really basically learn from the experiences of the past year and understand that they don't represent all Egyptians, that they cannot monopolize the political landscape, and that they have to work across the aisle. And so if that's the case, then what it'll produce is a far more mature, sophisticated, and politically savvy version of the Muslim Brotherhood. But again, I don't have an oracle or a crystal ball, so I'm not sure what they're going to do. So far, the results in the past year have been quite ominous. The Muslim Brotherhood have not appeared to be, as smart or as clever as all of us assumed or had hoped. But I imagine that this major blow with the removal of Morsi and what might happen between now and next year might actually trigger this kind of how do I say it, almost like a spiritual journey, if you will, for the Muslim Brotherhood to come back with full force, but have really a plan of action moving forward that will allow them to bring together their political adversaries in a climate of cooperation, because Egypt is too large for any single political group to govern at this point.
Thank you, Professor Iskandar, and thank you for being with us here on Sahara TV. Viewers, that was Professor Adel Iskandar, a scholar of Arab Studies at Georgetown University, here to give us an update on the situation in Egypt. Stay tuned, we have more coming on the way. Actually, next is our Skype call segment, so please join us on SaharaTV as we take your calls and listen to comments on our stories for today.